Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the fourth paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being "The real conduct of war only made its appearance incidentally and incognito." The text follows. The conduct of war, properly so called, that is, a use of the prepared means adapted to the most special requirements, was not considered as any suitable subject for theory, but one which should be left to natural talents alone. By degrees, as war passed from the hand-to-hand encounters of the Middle Ages into a more regular and systematic form, stray reflections on this point also forced themselves into men's minds, but they mostly appeared only incidentally in memoirs and narratives, and in a certain measure incognito. So here we continue with the historical approach that von Clausewitz gives to the theory of war and how it evolved throughout the ages. And from the title we can immediately spot here the real conduct of war only made its appearance incidentally and incognito. So we will now see basically what it means, but you can already understand that the appearance of whatever's been a military theorization evidently began from the lower strata, right? Even if and we're talking especially here about the Middle Ages, even if in other historical periods for sure there were treatises or something written in a less systematic form from lower milieu, let's say cultural milieus, etc. You can say that in the passage from the Middle Ages that here von Clausewitz actually makes a direct reference to in the text to the modern age, let's say, the real conduct of war made its appearance, almost by chance, right? Not completely by chance, of course, always triggered by some factors now we'll try to understand better. But fundamentally, in incognito, here what this Latin locution that von Clausewitz uses, that basically means that there was no even real interest to make it at the beginning something more widespread and used, right? That these were notes, reflections, and here von Clausewitz in the text says memoirs and narratives, etc. That started approaching these concepts fundamentally and began to think about them into a more systematic theory, right? So von Clausewitz says the conduct of war properly so called, and here he defines it, that is, the use of the prepared means adapted to the most special requirements, was not considered as any suitable subject for theory, right? So here, as we've explained also in the previous paragraph of this chapter, von Clausewitz is making here, as we've seen, he mentions eventually the Middle Ages, so there is some sort of real and concrete reference to an historical time, but here the concept is left vaguely. Here I believe von Clausewitz mentions the Middle Ages, making an example rather than sticking to kind of a linear view of the picture. As we know, and we have seen it from all the videos that we have made at this point, I was about to call them lessons, but as you know, I'm not really a fan of this definition given what I think we're doing on Schwerpunkt. It's more like a talk, but we've seen that von Clausewitz goes fundamentally beyond even the strictly historical matter. Von Clausewitz uses a lot of historical examples, but they're used in fact as examples, right? And what he cares about is to reflect on the concept, right? Pure and naked in many ways, so that this is not how a specific historical thread developed like. That is more like all human societies at one point kind of evolved like, right? And it's obvious that von Clausewitz he's mainly thinking about the Western world, Western history, but at the same time, this is valid really for for many historical realities, kind of all of them basically, and stressing one concept that, telling the truth here, is not a banal approximation, but on the contrary is a very refined and sophisticated thought, right? The idea that certain theories appear almost incidentally and randomly. And you might say, well, how? The theory should be the one that have to explain, so it must start from from the above, really, not really from the bottom, and eventually rising up. It's mostly something that is meant for didactic purposes, for educational purposes, and training and formation, etc. It can't be born like that. But as a matter of fact, it is born like that. This is a misconception, let's say, that happens very frequently, and especially thinking about what Middle Ages and the modern age especially produce, let's say, respectively in relation to each other, meaning that there is this widespread prejudice in our Western world, and I don't know in the rest of the world, but I presume that this in the West we kind of thought it in more or less in this way, that essentially there is such great and legitimate faith in reason, right, that we need somehow to think that preceded every kind of other thought. This is it's not a matter of being a Western thought, this is really a modernist thought, and it is highly mistaken, right, because even the history of Western civilization, objectively, does pass through a lot of practice and then theory, like any other civilization, right? The point of how theory was, and I'm not debating here the contents, because it's obvious the Western civilization does have certain intrinsic qualities that differentiated it from the others. So we're not discussing that. On the contrary, we should be careful here in bearing it in mind, because objectively what happened in the West, including from Clausewitz as the, let's say, the reaching point of a very long civilization's path, is objectively something that didn't happen in elsewhere. Like the way we thought our own world is largely a Western production, and that was eventually adopted also by other civilizations as a reflection. And here von Clausewitz is talking, making a very fine point by highlighting what we know now, historically speaking, about how even, of course, science proper and technology, etc., develop, right? You don't need a book that tells you how to do that. Many things are learned and taught even before that there is a book telling you how to do that, right? And our modern, and here it's crucial to understand, because the passage from what this medieval world in terms of military theory to a more systematic modern thought about war, etc., is fundamentally starting from a background that had largely and massively produced during the medieval civilization an enormous amount of know-how and of knowledge of skills, of crafts, of technologies that were moving the world, right? What we call as the Renaissance, and we depict as like the miracle come out of the darkness, is nothing but the direct consequence of the development of medieval civilization and the chance at that point of it to store enough surplus to pay people for studying, for researching, for becoming scholars, etc., that could create such theorizations. But what von Clausewitz here is saying further is that it hadn't started literally from that. There had always been here, always meant that it's basically impossible to distinguish when the thing began, that had conceived this theory. Naturally, von Clausewitz here is concentrating on the theory of the conduct of war, the Kriegführen, right? Kriegführen, which means properly here the use of prepared means adapted to the most special requirements, right? So something different, as we've seen in the first paragraph, from this art of war of medieval time, pre-modern times, was the mere preparation of the armed forces, right? And I'm stressing the fact that this is it kind of goes beyond temporal boundaries, is that objectively in the ancient world, something similar had already happened, right? So that obviously we have much, and really I stress much less from the ancient world that we have from the Middle Ages and obviously from the modern age. But even in that world, similar dynamics had taken place, right? We if you look at the Roman, let's say the tradition of Roman military treatise that evolved more than else actually into the Byzantine period. So it was mostly kind of a medieval thing than anything. But there were military treatises in the Hellenistic world, in the Roman world, and they had evidently been born at one point from some lower theorization that had to have appeared in some measure at some point. We lost most of it. It would be interesting to deepen this topic because what is that was really produced at the time. The ancient world, telling the truth, was much more arid, even compared just, for example, to the medieval one that we often think. So we shouldn't be excessively surprised to think that maybe centurions never cared a big deal to write, for example, about their own view of war, their memoirs, etc. So even Roman military treatises are conceived in a kind of a special fashion. They're a particular fashion that are very different from the ones that start appearing in the Renaissance, right? This is already a more advanced civilization than that. That, however, you can start seeing instead into the Middle Ages, because when you look at the development of military engineering, especially from, there is a big acceleration, especially from the 12th century onwards, you realize, and we do know it philologically speaking, even if we have also in this context a very few evidence that actually survived, that there was a world of know-how that was largely at that point it will start being written, so that's why we start recognizing it. So even before, obviously, there was something about it that, however, reveals a set of knowledge and of experience and of crafts and skills and preparation that objectively was incredible. As we all know, medieval civilization is properly the civilization of the machines. This was a world was experimenting a lot, right? You don't need an actual technological improvement, because actually medieval civilization didn't see a substantial improvement of civilization of technology from, let's say, the ancient world. They were pretty similar, comparable worlds actually, but there was a way to apply these technologies in a way that before had not been known, because naturally the context is still different from politically, socially, and we realized that there was all this ferment, let's say, of theory that probably was not systematic, of course, but it still was based on, at that point in the timeline, like in the 12th century, on the concept that it had at least to be written down, could be, and when you have that, you don't have necessarily the beginning of the theory, because that evidently has just begun, but evidently proves the evidence of a thought that needs to be preserved in a written form, because you have to come back on it. And this is not just a simple manualistic instruction, but it's also some kind of treatise, right? Even when the medievals read Vegetius, or the Byzantines also read something else, there is this beginning of thinking fundamentally that there was a way of disposing the troops in a fashion that could be in fact functional for winning, right? So it's not just a matter of how you have to prepare the troops, as von Clausewitz was exemplifying in the first paragraph. There is already something more. This starts from the Middle Ages, right? The theory is still not so systematic, so actually applicable, right? Because here from Clausewitz comes with the proper explanation, but conceptually, and this is just to show you how you can't really draw a line, a sharp line. Like you can't talk about a renaissance that emerged magically out of nothing, but of a thought that went accelerating, right? Here in the second paragraph, we have stressed this on the really not really at the beginning a substantial change in the contents, but really in the acceleration of their comparison, of their combination, and from there eventually the development of something that was starting to play with them in a more theoretical, detached fashion that could serve for some general principles starting to apply. This was very slow. Like even during the modern age, as we've seen, it would take a lot before a systematic idea of military theory would develop. You can argue that it ended only with von Clausewitz, really, but it's evident that there had somewhat always been, right? The concept is that there is a way to do it, right? That is starting to be requiring some further implementation, right? Because even if you look, for example, at the ancient world, many say that after Hannibal, for example, nothing was ever even invented more in the concept of combined arms proper, right? And this is actually true. I mean, like certain essential principles of military, of tactics, let's say, had been formulated already at the time. The point is that those civilizations were already able to applicate certain principles without really needing to write them down in a systematic form in order to translate it into actual use, right? Military treatises sometimes were just a set of even of anecdotes and of general historical consideration. That's why we don't have to be tricked by what here von Clausewitz is saying, because I realize that these paragraphs are very, very easy to misinterpret in some way. They can be taken as a positivistic stand, while von Clausewitz was completely opposed to these conceptions. And he's actually doing a very good job in a very pragmatic way, in a yet limpid and clear and agreeable, way that that we can all agree with substantially. That's what I try to say. Here he stresses two things. The first one is that the conduct of war was still not conceived up to this point because it was simply not considered as any suitable subject for theory, right? There was, in other words, no need. The way armies worked at this point on the field were it's not that they were easier. I mean, they were in relative terms to further military developments, historically speaking, kind of simpler systems, but it's not that it was difficult. That the difficulty stood simply in, knowing how to command an army. I mean, as we know, war remains always the same in terms of unknown, in terms of attrition, fog of war, and all the problems that can manifest to render the commander blind for 75% of whatever is going on around him. The point here is that whether a theory had been practically developed in a systematic fashion or not, no difference would have happened. So at that point, as it often happens in the history of of science, of technology, etc., there was no point in producing something. If something has no practical use, why are you inventing it in the first place? Why do you need it? why are you going to invest on it, right? What was objectively the necessity for a medieval commander, say of the 13th century, to have uh, a manual, a theory on the conduct of war, right? There was a great interest actually towards ancient sources, Vegetius that we mentioned before, but the actual playability on the field seems to have been unnecessary, simply because you realize that these guys knew far better what they had to do than any other manual written at the time could tell them. So that this tells you that that manual at that point was not needed. But war grows to be more complicated, to have to manage more resources. So even that medieval warfare is often undecisive from a strategic point of view, right? So with the development of artillery and modern warfare as we know it, there is much more at stake. There is a state that has to invest in this armaments and troops, etc. And there is a bit of training involved more than before. There are larger resources. There are tactical and strategical choices that at this point can really make a larger difference because armies are larger. They have a longer strategic range, so they can actually, if you do something wrong, you're going to pay more dearly for that. So that's where you need a sort of checking system that tells you, look, even if now commanders are still knowing what they do, we need to be more careful, because a mistake now, it's not like before that you lose a bunch of knights and maybe you can even ransom them, etc. It was quite a big deal at the time anyway, but it didn't cause massive changes and you still could live on. This time the fate of entire countries was decided on a single battle, and at that point you need to control your moves in a way that minimizes the losses, which is now something much more difficult to do, for which you have to start investing to some other form of skill that comes from theory, right? So that's where theory now is required, not because medieval couldn't really think about it, because he only what he knew was already learned on the field, right? At this point, the problem starts getting more complicated, and naturally you see that also in here, as we were saying before, there is really not a magical popping out of manuals that described you war as it is. You have to wait, more than 300 years with von Clausewitz for having the fulfillment of this path, right? So it's very progressive, it's very gradual, and it still corresponds to now new thinking that eventually at this point in history, after the Napoleonic Wars, had become kind of the ultimate problems, given that the fate of entire nations at this point could be wiped out, like it had happened for von Clausewitz Prussia, in a single day, on a single battle, right? So that's where you need far more than that. There are naturally larger, other problems related. I mean, obviously the armies were larger, their training was a big deal, committed resources of an entire state. So a situation that for which you could not afford anymore to just leave it to the hands of those who had already fought by saying, oh well, those guys know it. You need a much broader preparation that in fact starts distinguishing proper even what not before was not known. And here we could open an interesting philosophical reflection, right? I must say that for example, during my studies I've observed that when we criticize political military choices of the ancient world, ancient history, medieval history, old times, and we pretend somehow that we know better, right? that general didn't have to do that, that emperor didn't have to do that, that guy was good, that other was bad, one was right, the other was wrong, and all this stuff that we need to use because, I don't know what, it makes us feel better emotionally. I don't know where it leads to. I think it's, however, a pretty stupid thing. When you look at sources, you realize, first of all, most of the times we don't know how good then, nothing basically about this stuff, like it really was. Secondly, that there is a world that the sources make us understand to have existed, but that we can't in fact really read through, but that is much larger and complex and sophisticated than we can imagine. And in general, there is this impression that despite mistakes were made, of course, excuse me, there was still, however, the very deep understanding of what things like politics, society, and war worked, right? It's a sort of product of modernity, I believe. The idea that the mistake is so easily there. I mean, it's a much more difficult world, the one we live in terms of decision making today than it was in the past. Not that it was that it's tougher to make them, because before it was tougher to make them individually. But today it involves, in fact, a much broader theoretical challenge. It has much more to do, in fact, as von Clausewitz now implicitly says, with an abstraction of some sort, a detachment, that kind of a theoretical thinking, in fact, than what it was in the past, right? In the past, people by large were used to take matters in their own hands and to solve problems by themselves, and to do it with that intelligence that was needed for this task, and not really committing themselves very much more in terms of intellectual effort. And also in here, it would be interesting to distinguish what we really mean by intelligence, because it's obvious that we are kind of intelligent, but in different ways. I mean, if you never think, for example, to be more intelligent or capable than, I don't know, a Bulgar cavalryman of the 7th century AD, because you're not. Let's be honest about it. But it's obvious that we have a different way of thinking reality, right? We have a more systematic thought today. We have these patterns, structures of education. We get, in fact, much more theory than practice, right? But problem solving is something that doesn't always need theory, but actually it also needs practice. So there has been a shift that actually is something pretty recent. It's something like 1 century or so, from this more practically oriented intelligence to a more theoretically oriented intelligence. So I don't remember where I was going with this, but the concept at the end of the day is that if something didn't exist in the past, it's not because people were more stupid, but if anything, it's because you are more stupid now. You don't understand what that world was functioned like, and you don't understand what people needed and didn't need at the time to exist. And it's from this kind of mistake, in fact, that positivistic, modernistic, progressivistic ideologies stem from. The presumption that we are somewhat better qualitatively, morally today, because we have kind of a more theoretical system than what people were like before, which is something that practically doesn't, in fact, make any sense, in my opinion. Not because things like simply and exactly because choices between good and bad actually were the same, and sometimes those people were more capable of solving them in their own world than we are able to do today, and making much larger mistakes. And the reason why this happens, which in this sense would kind of make us more immoral under this regard, is that we tendentially are not trained. I can't say we're not predisposed, but we're not biologically, but we're not trained socially to make a big deal of theoretical effort proper. Which means what? That it is true, yes, we are more theoretically oriented than practically oriented. So it already means that we have lost that a part of that of our intelligence potential. But from the other side, choosing the theoretical path is actually much more challenging than choosing the practically oriented path. In line of theory, meaning that in line of principle, let's say better, because obviously our society today obliges us to be more theoretically oriented, so it's not negative to have made the switch given our current needs. But the problem is that it's way more difficult to be efficient when theoretically oriented than efficient when we're practically oriented, which in other words again means that we don't make enough effort today to be more intelligent than what we could be. There is an incredible factor of attrition, of inefficiency, of waste essentially of our intellectual capabilities, that is embarrassing. You can't see it in politics, in the way the average person reasons, like the idea of simple dichotomies, beyond which there is basically nothing else that is apparently needed to know, right? Instead, a theoretically oriented existence should be all about basically researching in continuation without ever thinking to have arrived to one point where you can say, I don't know, I may had those 3 or 5 years of university, I settled down, now I have a job, everything, and it's fine. I don't have to do anything about myself, my morality, my education, my responsibility, my rights, my duties. It's done, right? It can't work like that, and a great deal of our problems today really stem from this. They do really stem from really not even making the effort to pose ourselves in a functional relation with our own world. We just think it's all banal, it's all simple, it's all ABC, and seemingly the thing is getting dumped down, right? Even at the emotional level, it seems like emotions in for example, sentimental education in some way was not meant in the bad sense of the term, but a truly sentimental education, the education to feelings was a big deal in even reading or even watching some beautiful movie and trying to, especially in your childhood and your teenage, or traveling was a real traveling, not like the cheap hit and run of 2 or 3 days in a capital where everybody goes to take a selfie in front of a monument and coming back. Real traveling that is to say, entire weeks or even months in one place and studying its history, its culture, looking at people, looking at the past, looking at this new world. That's real education, traveling education. Having this ability of a deeper understanding. Sure, in the past it was mostly an elite thing. By certain standards it still is, but there is definitely no comparison with our way we live and the potential we can achieve through the means we have and the one in the past. People who think that we live now, today, with terrible difficulties are deeply ignorant and immoral people. And they are some of the greatest problems of our own society. Today you have basically the world knowledge a click away, and nobody gives a little, let's say damn about it. And they even complain. That's the real problem. That's the serious problem. That we are terribly lazy, that we're terribly oriented away. And don't get me wrong. It's not just a matter of a real of an active a matter of active purpose, because even von Clausewitz says how lazy human nature is, how human nature tendentially refuses difficult things to do. But it is obvious that when things get better, you start lowering your standards, meaning that what seemed a great difficulty before, now it does it's fortunately away, and you get down to other difficulties that are much smaller, but to you seem still kind of a big deal. And what happens as a differential in the process is you basically lower your capabilities of problem solving, because you're not confronted with pressing problems anymore. You're just confronted with extremely simple problems that may be, I don't say that they're not problems for real. Obviously, and there are naturally people who have big problems, of course, because life is difficult by itself. But don't tell me that it's more difficult than just 50 years ago, for not saying before. And this brings to the fact that we can't cope now with more serious problems that are much more complex problems, and there is someone who exploits this as well, because the person who has enough money to invest into certain ways to in fact exploit this form of ignorance or incapability can make a terrific amount of money. It's like take smartphones and computers. Like, everybody has a smartphone now. The computer market is sunk as far as you know. Why? Because banally, the computer is something you have to apply yourself a little bit more. The smartphone is made for imbeciles, basically. Everybody can use it, and yet it can do much less things than something else. Which means look at what smartphones are loaded. Just everything is about apps that are essentially games, right? So if that's the inclination, the orientation, it's just a dumping down of humans. That is definitely profitable for someone. Like, obviously, you are exploited for your stupidity. It happens all the time. We know that very well, that our stupidity is exploited at economical level, right? And as long as you're responsible for your own choices, is exclusively your fault, because unless that exploitation doesn't go beyond legal means, actually you are the imbecile that gets exploited, and there is nothing really bad, and people should exploit you at that point if it's legal, right? So, I know I'm getting completely out of the topic, but it's still part of the whole story. Like, this is the deeper perspective that von Clausewitz wants to give you. That is to say, never exchange here the cause for the effect. Never think that what is needed is that what appears, that what is produced, is a magic consequence through which people can arrive to who knows which endless achievements and prosperity. No, things that you have to that exist are the product of a civilization, are the products of a past, are the products of something of people who have worked pretty damn hard to have you this today, right? And you don't know anything, you don't do anything about it. And that is an immense loss. That is a grave danger, because it means you're losing the point. You're losing the point that war, like in this case von Clausewitz teaches, is not about the stronger. It's about the more intelligent who wins, right? And you can see it a bit in our, in all of our civilization. Look at the margin of difference that exists between actual scientific literature and the pinnacles that he has reached at this point, historically speaking, and look at what the standards of educations are today, broadly speaking. There is an enormous gap. Probably historically we never arrived to such an enormous gap like the one it is today. That is to say that in no time in history like today, the knowledge that we own in our, let's say, scientific progress is so distant by the average person, right? This is an enormous problem, enormous, because the political consequences of it could be terrible. And that is, we might arrive at one point we should need to effectively suspend certain rights, even a vote of decision making, civic right, because we have become effectively too stupid to understand how our world works, because we lack the necessary training and education to understand it. And I believe even today this is in front of everybody's eyes. The only problem is that today nobody seems really to care, because who should care about this, institutions and citizens, etc., are just either too disconnected or at least there is an active interest to operate on this gullibility, right? Social networks are an incredibly powerful mean in this sense to enact. I mean, from one side, it's obviously a very positive thing that such things exist, and they will be hopefully used one day to safeguard our own rights. But the trend today seems to be the other way around. Seems to be just a sort of tool to, orienting, for example, the electorate towards certain directions, and not really making a great deal about it. But this has an effective consequence on politics proper and on war as well, because we have seen in Vom Kriege that war is a political act. So even the relation that exists between politics and violence, in this sense, can be bent dangerously at a political level, but by those who effectively understand more in a completely minority way, so that people growing ignorant about this, the awareness of this connection, for example, are much more easily exploitable, right? This is important when you, especially when you think that there is an active fight actually for disconnecting this connection. The idea, for example, that politics should be completely disconnected from violence in the first place, which is a typical pacifistic stand, like saying that that politics should be awfully not violent, is translated into politics. I mean, political action would say better that politics is disconnected from violence. At that point, you make people gravely ignorant on an actual issue that is instead extremely educational. Is the Clausewitzian paradigm of understanding that instead violence does have an ineliminable connection with politics, and that you can't basically by refusing this, by rejecting this, you are giving up even your own individual rights, because you don't understand at that point what politics serves for. When is violence applicable, like for defending your country from a threat, either from an enemy, either foreign or domestic, and you just think that you should remain passive to any condition, right? So this is the real problem. Wu claims that politics is disconnected by violence, is increasing violence as a consequence. Because objectively, using violence is not the best way most of the times. It's just the speediest, but potentially also the most dangerous, in fact. And you must know, in order not to avoid in order to avoid actually making wrong decisions where people die, right? When it's the case to use it or not. And if you don't have a strategic culture, you can't understand that. And you're done. And you're actually doing much more harm to your own society than you would do if, you were, if you were actually just stating that, yeah, politics and violence are connected, which is kind of a obvious thing. So here these points are very interesting. The second point that von Clausewitz is making is also very important, is that historically speaking, the conduct of war was required simply through the, let's say better, there was not the need of a theory on the conduct of war, because the conduct of war was left to the natural talents alone, right? Or this is also important because, as we were saying before, warfare in the past, previous to the development of a systematic military theory, was objectively based on individual talents. Like, it was kind of obvious, that there were these talents for real that knew how to effectively use the means adapted, the prepared means adapted to most special requirements, right? They were able to, it's very rare to find historically a figure that had a complete overview of what all the armed forces were practically functioning like. There are great reformers, there are great tacticians, there are great strategists. In the luckiest occasions we can have, that chances in which they are kind of the same persons, but it's often really not the case. But at that point the talent is enough, right? The immediacy of the need of command and of control of the armed force and the use of the armed forces is and their organization is somewhat stronger than the general comprehension of a generalized theory to which these organizers have to attain to, right? So sometimes you just need the person, preferably, that already knows how to use those armies, and you're fine with that. And the improvement of this individual's ability mostly comes from direct experience that is often also gotten on the field through military career and rising through the ranks, so that is enough. You don't need a book, you don't need a theory for that. As long as armies are relatively simple, and warfare in general is relatively simpler, right? And mostly revolves on the problem of fielding troops rather than in the first place, rather than even knowing how to use them, right? So this for a long time was quite of a big deal. That didn't quite make war exactly or exclusively just the mere preparation of the armed forces. This talent, however, made up for the theory, right? And it definitely contained some form of theory that, unfortunately, has not been written. But the reason why it's not been written is already by itself a historical evidence of the fact that it basically wasn't needed. So this is particularly important. There are certain military talents that can do the know better, right? And military talents, as we have seen, are something extremely complex to obtain. Like, it's obvious that military geniuses that are rare, right? But it's also more likely that in a society that is especially so in contact with war, they tend to emerge, right? Even though here we're on a middle ground, because as von Clausewitz explained in the first book, the simpler society is, the more difficult it is, the rise of a military genius as we mean it, because it's sufficient, it's talent, his charisma, his whatever that is already functional to that society. It doesn't really need more. When civilization improves, instead, you have basically a leadership that emerged in the first place because it was needed for the sake of command to adjust the problems of command. Because evidently warfare had become a too complicated business from which you need a much more articulated hierarchy that needs also a further specialization, and in parallel with it you have the development of theory that sediments from kind of initially from know-how, this talents, this knowledge, even historical knowledge. Always remembering here that, for example, something that we know that military commanders were often thought in the past, not just right now, but also in very ancient times, like the Middle Ages, the ancient world, was effectively history. That history that was largely political and military history, right? Which evidently served some purpose, because that's evidently not the conduct of war theoretically systematized, but it is still a way to prepare yourself to the to what you will find yourself similarly in front of, right? So political and military matters, like, think about how medieval monarchs studied the deeds of Constantine, or it's not that things were dramatically different, right, from that past. There were things they could relate to, and that they helped in making them think at a deeper level, according to relative to certain matters that, given that political and social level of development, were enough to give the essentials for even commanding, right? Here Clausewitz says, by degrees, as war passed from the hand-to-hand encounters of the Middle Ages into a more regular and systematic form, stray reflections on this point, stray reflections on this point also forced themselves into men's minds, but they mostly appeared only incidentally in memoirs and narratives, and in a certain measure incognito. So let's first of all concentrate on this first phrase. By degrees, as war passed from the hand-to-hand encounters to the Middle Ages into a more regular and systematic form, there is this development of a theory, yet this very gradual. So this first part is very interesting because von Clausewitz stresses the transition from a kind of a melee warfare into the typical of the Middle Ages to a more regular and systematic one. Here it's referring to wars, not talking about theory or even the conduct of war strictly meant, but even though it's referring to it. So it says by degrees, but here the core concept that, in my opinion, it poses the accent to is the evolution of firearms, like the development of firearms, and this idea that in fact even just from a tactical point of view, which is the theory of employment of armed forces, and it's kind of the most it's the field in which a more positive doctrine can be deduced from in theory of war. There were more variables to take into consideration. When warfare is limited to hand-to-hand combat, also here dynamics are pretty simple, right? There's an excruciating similarity between the various arms like cavalry and infantry, but also between land and sea encounters. There is the concepts are fairly similar. There is definitely a technicality that evolves, the war of weapons, of equipment, of institutions, etc. But it's mostly really about getting there and taking the enemy out at close range. Yes, there are slings, there are arrows, there are crossbows, but still, yet they're not decisive. The bulk remains infantry at the end of the day, There are certain contexts in which, of course, missile troops are kind of more important than others. Think about the steppes, etc. But essentially, war is simple at the point that you still have to measure it more or less in terms of human of human reaching capabilities, right? When you start having a situation in which you have you can't knock one man out just by pulling a trigger with an arquebus, well, that starts to evolve a bit more, like saying, should we systematize a little bit this use? Is that because in fact, even in previous warfare, it was about that. It was about, for example, sticking to formation solidly, etc. Now there is the same thing, but also using new weapons with a kind of more with a broader reaching capabilities that present you with kind of more options than just the obvious, making, in terms of volume of fire and concentrated fire, etc. It's also about how should I use this weapon now that gives me so much results, but that also costs a lot. Never, in this sense, think, and here from Clausewitz is very cleverly putting the accent on the gradual transformation. This is that, this is not, in fact, the typical theoretical approach that we have today of essentially saying, well, okay, this is an abstract situation, right? Just to think about a battlefield in which everything is somewhat detached from all the rest. It's as if it was just a scientist's cabin where the experiment can be carried out. No, there is always a cost behind it. There's always a policy. There's always society. Always remember the Clausewitzian most important phrase, basically, that war is nothing but an instrument of policy by other means. That is literally what it is. It's not ever. War is a political act, and it's never freed of political control. It's constantly under political control, even during the campaign, even during the battle, right? And definitely social cost, etc. So here it's not just a matter of, okay, let's see how we can use this better on the field, but also think of how, because it has that specific performance as a weapon, right? Or as a tactic in general at that point. Let's see properly, how we can minimize. The problem is that there is an enormous pressure from politics and society to use this means better. It's not just paradoxically about saving your skin on the battlefield that already strengthens your senses in a way. You can. There is a directional problem at this point, and that's where theory develops, right? Because it's not about the individual soldier that decides at that point how that weapon is used. It's the army commander that decides how that has to be used, and that entails a much deeper collective training and coordination that is required to attain certain results. There is this idea that now there is an evolution, there is a change. During Renaissance, there was the idea that, in fact, now firearms were taking over. Like it had been understood that there had been a sensible change, and that things would continue kind of evolving that way. Maybe, I don't know. Well, it would be interesting to study when and how this happened, because that there are also traditionalist branches in certain cases of successful anachronisms under this regard, but it's still not really the same. It's really it's understood that this is not the same thing that it's always been, right? And things are speeding up, they're kind of accelerating towards one direction. So there is a regularization and systematization of the form. This is how von Clausewitz puts it. It's really about making it almost mathematical, right? There was this obsession in Renaissance warfare of really replicating certain mathematical principles, certain fixed models, right? This is typical of theory. It's not yet the modernist thinking in its deeper development, but it's definitely something more theoretically oriented. The idea that it's not just about the contents, right? It's about how you use them. It's about how you employ these means. Given that the means now are increasingly standardized, or at least there's even an effort to standardize them further, because at that point that's what really makes the difference. And it costs, and it has a huge cost. And cannons and firearms in general have to be produced in a certain way. They need to be fielded and maintained, and it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop to the fight. It's really something about which the whole country is committed in a certain degree. So it's beautiful to think it mathematically, right? Even if this mathematic need is still on a theoretical level, it will remain largely on a theoretical level because, in fact, as we know very well at this point, war, there is no science of war. You can't mathematicize war, presuming to win battles simply by solving equations. Nobody will ever be able to do that. There is just another approach, and this is interesting. That is based on experience, of course. Is the art of war that is what, by the way, is continuously reconfirmed into our days. In Clausewitzian terms, the war of the 20th century, 21st century, doesn't do anything but reconfirming steadily and unavoidably and incontrovertibly Clausewitzian principles. War does function in this way, and there is no point in even thinking to change it, because von Clausewitz is not talking to you about the war of his own times. It is talking to you of war of all times, of how it will always be, because it doesn't start from a relative detail. It doesn't start from the Napoleonic Wars. It doesn't start from the practice. It starts from the theory, in fact. It starts from an order that starts from logic, from considering the human nature, first of all, and not what the theory should be. And what other thinkers were doing at the time was the exactly different thing. That was trying to basically make a sort of a aseptic picture of war by saying, let's throw away the human factor. Let's think that this is just mathematics, and that it can work in that way. And that was a positivistic approach to military history that failed, because ultimately our militaries today are all Clausewitzian. Because Clausewitzian theory won, in proving that there is no way in how you can predict certain things. And at that point, it's better for you to invest on a certain degree of preparation rather than pretending to solve the problem. Because there are so many elements, the infinite elements, you can't even calculate that. It doesn't even make sense to try to put it at a mathematical level. Yes, there is a degree of positivity, right? Never think that Clausewitzian theory is completely devoid of positivity. There is always a margin to that, because in fact you should be an intelligent person, as we were saying before, rather than a strong person, preferably. If you really had to choose, there should be both, but it's mostly about intelligence. Intelligence is reason. Reason is knowledge. So it's always based theoretically. I mean, the best way to solve it theoretically would be war. It would be maths, sorry, but war is not effectively solvable by that, even by a satisfactory margin. So that's when Clausewitz in Theory reveals its genius, because it is really like that. And acknowledging it is art, right? Because of modernistic thinking, right? A medieval man would have not fallen into this mistake, right? It would have been difficult for him to conceive certain things, but paradoxically, he was already living by them, right? And it's very fascinating how societies structure effectively themselves in a kind of a rational way without rationalizing it. This is extraordinary. I mean, it's a miracle. You may think it's a miracle that societies stand, given the degree of conflictuality, of enmity, of disorder, etc. Instead, they do work. And we always criticize them rightfully, but they do work, and they still stand. So the point is, yeah, okay, this doesn't mean that it has always to be this way. It can also crumble. But up to now, human history has proven that we can do a lot because we have a way to self-preserve what we create. Even if we can destroy someone else in the process through it. Can't be that bad. 20th century proved it dramatically. Even, of course, certain societies basically destroying themselves, and obviously for this myth of being able to determine exactly in positivistic terms what things could go like. But that's in fact, even sometimes at a strategical level, lack of Clausewitzian culture, right? There's a big difference between Lenin, for example, and Stalin or Mao. Lenin was a Clausewitzian, for example, and that's how he won a desperate situation like the Russian Civil War. But there are many of these. These are not paradoxes. They're really, they're real things. Real matters that count wherever you want to conceive them like, but there is a mechanism in society that let's rephrase it, that when you look at the past, you don't have to think that society was waiting for your own way of seeing things through a theoretical, rational way to make it more rationally, more practically than you do in relative terms. Reflect on this before you even speak sometimes bad about the Middle Ages, etc., the obscure, the Dark Ages, and so think about what it was, what the real options were. Because sometimes we made history by saying, those guys were stupid. They could have invented that. Why didn't they do that? They had the know-how. Yes, but what about where to apply the know-how? It's like those people who think that since objectively in Hellenic times steam engine was unknown, that in the ancient world you could create an industrial revolution. People who reason like this, I think they don't have absolutely any idea of what not just history of technology or economy is, but really of history in general is. Because just by making this statement, you don't think it practically. You're just thinking, not even theoretically, but just simply abstractly. You're not thinking history. You're thinking of applying an engineering notion after centuries of technology that evolved through I don't know what's the term in English, but what firms around, let's say, the technology that makes it work. You can't produce a technology and hoping to apply it in a world that doesn't have, for example, the components just for or the actual economical convenience of producing certain amount of things. How do you think the ancient world could sustain an industrial technology in general, at a structural level? They would have starved to death. Well, whatever. Here, the whole internet is freaking doing weird stuff, so stupid trash. Wait a second. I'm finding you the words a little bit. Satellite activities. Yes, that's what the spin-off. I didn't know it, but I never pronounced satellite activities and spin-off. If you don't have that, what do you think steam engine was starting to be developed in the 18th century en masse with the Industrial Revolution? Because someone invented a steam engine. I mean, do you believe in fairy tales? Sometimes I get so discouraged because I trust you as my followers, but you hear certain things around that are really, really crazy, and they are the perfect symptom of the problems that I was describing to you before. Okay, so continuing with, let me see, with point, systematic form, stray reflect, so basically Von Clausewitz is saying, how this passage is taking place, and he says that there are these stray reflections on this point, so on war and the conduct of war, that also forced themselves into men's minds, but it mostly appeared only incidentally in memoirs and narratives, and in a certain measure incognito, right? So what does this mean? Is what we had began with, because this is in the title actually. So that this idea that a theory of the conduct of war could be formulated appeared mostly only incidentally. Here it says in memoirs and narratives, in a certain measure incognito, right? Now this is very interesting because sometimes I was thinking about the importance, for example, of narrative sources that in certain, especially in certain historiographical traditions, are kind of ridiculized because certain people at least believe that, I don't know, chronicles are unreliable or that there is no. It's because also in here it's a positivistic problem. Even here we can't digress on how to use sources and their reliability and how you can draw certain informations but here memoirs and narratives. Memoirs are also narratives sometimes, telling the truth. But it makes you understand that this need to formulate a theory of the conduct of war emerges fundamentally from a very spontaneous need. It doesn't start at the top. That's our obsession as modern people. The changes have to happen at the top. That you can impose things on society and society will magically work like that. They did it in communist China. 50 million people died. Great leap forward. It is built an iron furnace to start producing iron and other stuff to these peasant communities of China. They stopped. They didn't have the resources for doing that, but they were obliged. So they starved to death because they couldn't cultivate anymore and what they needed. And these are the great disasters that happen. So even in having negative prejudices, that's the point I would like to get to like having this idea that there was an obscurity from which a certain point during the Renaissance the light appeared is a potentially criminal thought, because it's no different from this dirigistic policies on societies that pretend that by changing things from the top the base will follow. The base is capable of destroying the top. regularly. This is what history teaches us, and often it happens very bluntly. So pretending that the birth, even of our theory, of what we truly believe in, reason, rationality, it emerged from this detachment from what the obscure and trivial society of pre-enlightenment, of pre-renaissance is garbage. Is actually a crime. Is not understanding that it was that same substratum that produced theory. And he started doing it very autonomously, very independently. From memoirs and narratives. Starting formulating. If you have, some experience of especially modern literature, you can trace pretty well this track, before you arrive to the Enlightenment, you can see what the effort really was in trying to build the basis of a theory. That sometimes was based on ridiculous things, like, even science was mixed now together with things like alchemy or magics or astrology, and it was pretty messed up in that sense, but it still was struggling for combining. And that tells you, by the way, how much civilization is needed to formulate. That is, you can't give a book of physics to a 15th century scholar and pretending that he would be able eventually to spread this and to make it apply and to make it, to save hundreds of years of discovery. Maybe some effect would make, but society wouldn't change immediately. And it's also dangerous in the sense how we interpret history, often looking at, searching for what it would have been rather than what it was in general at that time. That is a real problem. It has to do with the narcissistic attitude that we have towards ourselves, towards our world, our civilization. Also, historiography does this. That there is this fascination with certain intellectual achievements and formulas that, however, tend to crystallize and to sclerotize and to eventually grow useless. And then there's a point in which you have to tear it down, and that gets pretty violent. So instead, there should be a bit more of a flexibility since the basis. The give space to who has kind of a doubt more than who follows faithfully, the group, that less people doubt healthily. I don't remember what it was, Mark Twain. I don't remember that, you said something like, but I don't think it was him. Maybe I'm mistaken. The time in which I start basically agreeing with, I don't remember whether the government or that's where I should get worried. We should always doubt. We should be taught to doubt without becoming skepticists. Remaining equilibrated, but still knowing that the intellectual gratifications are an illusion most of the times. That, once you have learned something is beautiful, but, after a while you have to start digging once again, because it doesn't end there. It's just the beginning of something else. And frankly, I think our societies are still pretty primitive. Like, I don't think that we live in a particularly sophisticated world. I mean, it's pretty complicated and complex, sure, but it's so refined, sophisticated, really not. That's why we like to read history in relative terms, because it seems as if that was more of a of an accomplishment what we've come so far, but there is so much to do. So much. We will never solve probably our core problems of death and suffering, and hopefully, well, this will be a driving force. I mean, it's maybe a meager consolation, but that's where you're going to live it with. And a great part of our civilization is born out of trying to solve most of these problems. So that's when I when it gets easier, you get a sort of lack of of commitment, of purpose, because that's also what difficulties do, to keep you alive as a civilization, as moral systems, and so on. But this is just too banal reflection, I would say, at this point, because it's pretty evident by certain standards. So the problem is how you deal with that. The problem is how willing you are to spread these ideas and to make something about it, right? And I truly believe that these topics are gonna be hot topics soon. Like our civilization will need this for sure. Like unless maybe we will get polarized through media, through senseless problems that will just make us fighting for someone else fundamentally among each other. Either we will acknowledge these intrinsic problems and make something about it, and that's the next step and big challenge for our civilization in the future. It won't be a problem of technology, won't be a problem of environment, or this will exist, but they will be all subordinated to this actually intellective problem of ours, because it's really an intellective problem. It does get it gets manifested as a symptom at an emotional level, but it's really an intellect. I mean, it's a consequence of a lack of reasons, lack of intelligence, lack of education. It's not really an emotional problem. Okay, well, we will maybe talk about this on another occasion. For now, I hope that at least von Clausewitz gets a bit more. I try to bring him a little bit beyond the boundaries of military history, because I believe that was his sense was really about. Because I'm realizing now by studying a bit more thoroughly the Vom Kriege is that von Clausewitz really doesn't talk just about war. I mean, his principles are not really just about war. They can be applied basically for every single damn thing. So von Clausewitz is more than just about war, and I would like to expand this thought, because his name is tied to it so much that it seems like it's. But if you consider human existence as conflict, which is still not war, there is a difference between conflict and war actually, but it's that war, this conflict gets solved in ways, when you decide to solve in certain ways that objectively go beyond war itself, that go beyond mere arms. They really have to do with political and social relations. Well, okay, for now I quit it here, and I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.